The morning sun peeked through the slightly smudged windows of Joe's diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor tiles. Steam rose from the coffee maker, mixing with the mouth-watering aroma of fresh bacon and pancakes. Mai balanced 3 plates along her forearm with the precision of a tightrope walker, her worn sneakers squeaking against the floor as she navigated between the busy tables. "Order up for table 7, called out Uncle Pete from the kitchen, his voice barely rising above the cheerful clinking of cutlery and morning chatter. Mia's eyes darted to the clock. 7:45 a.m., peak breakfast rush. She'd been on her feet since 5, but her steps remained light and purposeful. The regulars filled their usual spots. Mr. Kumar reading his newspaper in the corner booth, the construction crew huddled around their massive breakfast platters by the window, and Mrs. Rodriguez sipping her 3rd cup of coffee while grading papers. They all knew Maya as the quiet girl who somehow never mixed up their orders, even on the busiest mornings. "Hey, sweetie, could I get a refill?" called out Mrs. Rodriguez, raising her empty cup with a warm smile. May nodded, already reaching for the fresh pot of coffee she'd kept ready. Her hands moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the bustling diner. The same hands that would later transform into something entirely different. "You're an angel." Mrs. Rodriguez sighed as the steaming coffee filled her cup. "I don't know how you do it all." If only they knew. None of the customers realized that beneath her flour-dusted apron and practical ponytail lay the soul of a classical pianist. Every evening, after her double shifts left her feet aching and her uniform smelling of French fries, Mia's fingers would trade sticky maple syrup for ivory keys. The community center's old piano wasn't much, slightly out of tune, with a sticky B-flat key and scratches that told stories of countless beginners. But in the quiet hours between sunset and midnight, it became Mia's entire world. She taught herself to play through YouTube videos and borrowed music books, her determination making up for what she lacked in formal training. "Toast is burning." Uncle Pete's voice snapped her back to reality. Mai rushed to the kitchen, seamlessly falling back into the rhythm of the diner. She grabbed plates, wiped tables, topped up coffee cups, and smiled at customers, all while her mind hummed with the melody she'd been practicing the night before. A loud crash from table 3 made everyone jump. Little Raj, the dentist's son, had knocked over his orange juice. Before his mother could even reach for the napkins, Mai was already there with a mop and fresh glasses, handling the situation with such gentle efficiency that the boy's embarrassed tears turned to giggles. "You're such a natural at this," his mother said gratefully, but Mai just smiled. Natural wasn't the word for it. She'd learned to be precise, patient, and present, skills that served her equally well whether she was carrying plates or practicing chopping. The morning rush began to thin out as the clock struck 9. Mai leaned against the counter for a moment, letting out a quiet breath. Her fingers drummed an invisible melody on the worn formica surface. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. The same piece she'd been struggling with for weeks now, trying to capture its ethereal sadness in the empty community center. "You're doing that thing again," Uncle Pete said kindly, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the counter. "Eat something. Can't play on an empty stomach." Mai looked up, surprised. In the 3 years she'd worked at Joe's, she'd never mentioned her evening activities to anyone. Uncle Pete winked at her questioning look. "These old eyes see more than you think. Now eat up. The lunch crowd will be here before you know it." She picked up her fork, hiding a smile. Maybe someone had noticed after all. But there was no time to dwell on it. The bell above the door chimed, announcing new customers, and Mai was back on her feet, ready to start another dance through the diner, her secret symphony playing quietly in her heart. The lunch rush had finally died down, and Mai was wiping down tables when she noticed something propped against the wall near table 12. Her heart skipped a beat. A violin case, worn leather with brass fixtures, obviously expensive and definitely forgotten by its owner. She carefully moved it behind the counter, making a mental note to check the day's receipts for the customer's information. "That belongs to the old man with the blue scarf," Uncle Pete called from the kitchen. "Been coming in for the past week. Orders the same thing, soup and grilled cheese, extra crispy." May nodded, remembering the quiet customer who always said thank you in different languages. She'd noticed his hands, musician's hands, with long fingers and deliberate movements. He'd sat there for hours today, watching the rain through the window while making notes in a small book. After her shift ended, May found herself walking through the drizzle with the violin case carefully protected under her umbrella. The address from the receipt led her to a small house with a red door, window boxes full of herbs, and the sound of piano music drifting through partially opened windows. Her finger had barely touched the doorbell when the music stopped. The door opened to reveal a man from the diner, his blue scarf replaced by a comfortable cardigan. "Ah," he smiled, "my waitress guardian angel. Please come in from the rain." The living room stopped Mai in her tracks. A gorgeous grand piano dominated the space, sheet music scattered across every surface, and the walls lined with photos of concert halls and orchestras. Her eyes lingered on the piano, its lid propped open like a giant black wing. "I'm Mr. Lee," the old man said, taking the violin case with visible relief. "Though in my performing days I was known as Master Lee. Would you like some tea? It's the least I can do to thank you for bringing back my old friend." Mai found herself sitting on a worn leather couch, holding a delicate teacup while Mr. Lee told stories about touring with symphony orchestras. "Music has a way of finding its own," he said suddenly, watching her over his cup. "I've seen how your fingers move when you're working, like they're playing invisible keys." Heat crept up Mei's neck. I practice sometimes. At the community center. Nothing special." Mr. Lee's eyes crinkled. "Would you play something for me?" Panic fluttered in her chest. "Oh, I couldn't. I'm not properly trained. I just—" "Music isn't about proper training," he interrupted gently. "It's about what's in your heart. Please." Before she could think of another excuse, she was sitting at the piano, its keys cool and smooth under her fingers. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to play the piece she knew best, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Her hands trembled at first, but soon the familiar melody took over. She forgot about her audience, lost in the way the notes echoed in the perfect acoustics of the room. When the final note faded, she heard a soft extraordinary behind her. Mr. Lee was standing there, violin in hand, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Such raw talent," he whispered. "But you've never had lessons." Mai shook her head. "Couldn't afford them. I learned from videos and books." "And yet you play with more feeling than many of my conservatory students ever managed." He sat down beside her on the bench. "There's a competition coming up, the Young Musicians Fellowship. The winner receives a full scholarship." His fingers brushed the keys. "I could help you prepare, if you're interested." Mei's heart soared, then plummeted as reality crashed back in. "I work double shifts most days. I have rent, bills." "We'll figure something out," Mr. Lee said firmly. "Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden away in empty rooms after midnight. Think about it." Walking home that evening, Mai felt like she was floating. The street lamps created halos in the misty rain, and every car horn or distant siren seemed to blend into a symphony of possibility. For the first time, her dreams felt less like distant stars and more like lights guiding her home. Early morning light filtered through Mei's tiny apartment window as she stared at her monthly budget spread across the kitchen table. Coffee cups ringed the edges of her worn notebook, evidence of another sleepless night. The numbers refused to add up differently, no matter how many times she rearranged them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister, Lynn. "Got my midterm grades back. Top of the class again. Missing you, big sis." Attached was a photo of Lynn grinning in front of her college library. Mai smiled despite her exhaustion. This was why she worked so hard. Their parents had always stressed education, and after they passed, Mai had promised herself that Lynn would get the chances she never had. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. 4:30 a.m. In an hour, she needed to be at the diner. Her fingers were still stiff from yesterday's practice session with Mr. Lee. The competition pieces were challenging, pushing her further than she'd ever gone before. But the practice schedule he proposed would mean cutting her work hours almost in half. "Your technique is promising," Mr. Lee had said yesterday, "but you need more practice time. 4 hours minimum, every day." His words echoed in her head as she got ready for work, her hands automatically going through the familiar motions of tying her apron. The morning rush at the diner felt different now. Every coffee pot she lifted, every plate she carried, seemed heavier than before. Her mind kept drifting to the piano, to the pieces she needed to master. She caught herself humming Chopin while refilling sugar dispensers, her fingers twitching with phantom melodies. "You're a million miles away today," Uncle Pete said during her break, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her. "Everything okay?" Mai poked at her eggs. "Had you ever wanted something so badly it scared you?" Uncle Pete leaned against the counter, his weathered face thoughtful. "Back in my 20s, I had a chance to open my own restaurant. Real fancy place, not like this old diner. But it meant taking a huge loan, risking everything." "What happened?" "Chickened out. Played it safe." He wiped his hands on his apron. Been wondering what if ever since. The lunch rush brought an unexpected face. Mr. Lee, without his usual blue scarf. He sat at the counter this time, watching May work with keen eyes. During a quiet moment, he waved her over. "I've been thinking," he said, stirring his soup. "The competition has a cash prize too. Not just the scholarship. $5,000 for first place." Me's heart stuttered. That kind of money could cover Lynn's textbooks for the whole year. But the registration fee. "Already taken care of," Mr. Lee said quietly. "Consider it an investment in the arts." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I can't accept." "You can, and you will." His voice was firm but kind. Sometimes pride is more expensive than accepting help. That evening, after her shift, Mai sat at Joe's ancient office desk. The schedule request form seemed to blur in front of her tired eyes. Asking for reduced hours felt like jumping off a cliff. Terrifying and irreversible. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Lynn. Found an old video of Mom playing piano at that wedding. Remember how she always said music feeds the soul? Missed her songs so much. Mai touched the screen, remembering their mother's hands on piano keys, how she'd play traditional songs after dinner. The memory hit her like a physical ache. What would Mom say about this chance? About playing it safe versus reaching for dreams? Joe found her still sitting there an hour later. Without a word, he picked up the schedule form, glanced at it, and signed. "About time," he said gruffly. "Was wondering when you'd ask." "But the morning rush." "We'll manage." He put the signed form in front of her. Some things are more important than pancakes. Walking home that night, May felt the weight of her decision in every step. The practical voice in her head kept calculating bills and hours, but another voice, one that sounded surprisingly like her mother's, was humming a melody of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, some dreams were worth the risk. Word spread through the diner like syrup on a hot pancake. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd overheard Mai practicing at the community center one evening. She mentioned it to Mr. Kumar during the morning coffee rush, who told the construction crew, who talked about it over their usual breakfast platters. Soon, the whole diner was buzzing with their quiet waitress's secret talent. "Play something for us." Little Raj would beg whenever his mom brought him in for breakfast. Maya would just smile and shake her head, but her cheeks would flush pink with pleasure at being seen, really seen, for the first time. One rainy Tuesday morning, Mr. Wong from the music shop down the street came in specifically to find her. "My shop's closed after 6, he said, sliding a key across the counter. "Got a beautiful upright piano in the back room. Better than that community center one. It's yours to practice on whenever you want." May tried to refuse, but Mr. Wong wouldn't hear it. "My wife used to play," he said softly. "She'd want someone to use it." He left before Mai could even thank him properly, leaving behind an untouched cup of coffee and the key that felt warm in her pocket. The regulars started asking about the competition, genuine interest in their voices. Uncle Pete put up a small notice board near the register with competition details and practice updates. Some days, when Mi's shoulders drooped with exhaustion, customers would leave extra-large tips with notes saying, "For the piano fund," or "Music lessons aren't cheap." The construction crew, led by big-hearted Mr. Patel, started bringing their lunch breaks later just to hear her practice through the music shop's open windows. They'd sit on the curb, hard hats still on, sharing sandwiches and nodding appreciatively at the classical music drifting out. "Never understood this fancy music before," Mr. Patel admitted one day, "but hearing you practice that same piece over and over, now I get it. It's like building something beautiful, one brick at a time." Even the grumpy morning coffee crew, a group of retirees who usually complained about everything from the weather to the newspaper headlines, got involved. They organized a fundraiser, setting up a donation jar by the register with a hand-drawn picture of a piano on it. For sheet music and proper performance clothes, Mrs. Chen, their self-appointed leader, declared, "Can't have our girl showing up in her waitress uniform now, can we?" One particularly busy morning, May overheard a customer asking Joe why the service was slower than usual. She froze, guilt washing over her. Her reduced hours were affecting the whole diner. But Joe just shrugged. "Good stories take time," he said. "People come here now for more than just eggs and coffee. They come for hope with their hash browns." Besides, he added with a rare smile, "Business is actually up. Seems folks like their breakfast with a side of inspiration." The most unexpected support came from Mr. Lee's former students. They started dropping by the diner, ordering coffee, and leaving behind precious advice scribbled on napkins. Tips about handling performance anxiety, breathing exercises, even specific fingering techniques for tricky passages. "We're all rooting for you," one of them told her. "Master Lee hasn't been this excited about teaching in years. You've given him back his spark." Late one evening, as Mai practiced in Mr. Wong's shop, she heard voices outside. The construction crew had stayed late at their site, and now they were helping Mr. Wong install better lighting above the practice piano. Mrs. Rodriguez was there too, grading papers at a small table nearby, claiming the music helped her focus. Mi's fingers paused over the keys as she watched them through the window. This unlikely group of people who had become her cheerleaders. Her throat tightened with emotion. The music had always been her private dream, her secret escape. But somehow, it had grown into something bigger, something that belonged not just to her, but to all of them. She turned back to the piano, taking a deep breath. The competition piece flowed from her fingers, stronger and more confident than before. Because now she wasn't just playing for herself. She was playing for every person who believed in her, every small kindness that had added up to this moment. Their faith in her rang out in every note, turning her solo into a symphony of community support. The text message came during the Monday morning rush. Mi nearly dropped the coffee pot when she saw it was from Lynn's roommate. "Lynn's in the hospital. Don't worry, she's okay. But they want to run some tests." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mi's hands shook as she tried to pour coffee, spilling some on the counter. Uncle Pete took one look at her face and gently pried the pot from her fingers. "Go," he said simply. "We've got this covered." The hospital waiting room was too bright, too sterile. Lynn looked small in the big bed, pale, but trying to smile. "It's just exhaustion," she insisted. I've been staying up late studying. Got dizzy in class, that's all. But the doctors wanted to run more tests, expensive tests. Words like comprehensive screening and preliminary results floated around them, each one feeling like a weight added to May's shoulders. She sat by Lynn's bed, holding her sister's hand, while her mind raced through calculations. The competition was in 2 weeks. Her practice sessions with Mr. Lee had been going well, but there was still so much work to do. And now this, medical bills piling up just when she'd reduced her work hours. That evening's practice session was a disaster. Her fingers felt like lead, stumbling over passages she played perfectly just yesterday. The beautiful Rachmaninoff piece that had been flowing so naturally now sounded mechanical, empty. "Stop," Mr. Lee said finally, after she'd fumbled the same section for the 3rd time. "Something's wrong. Your music is screaming it." Mai stared at the keys, seeing instead the hospital bills, Lynn's pale face, the competition requirements. Her vision blurred, and suddenly she realized she was crying, really crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and impossible to hide. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I was crazy to think I could. My sister's sick, the bills are piling up, and I'm here playing piano like some kid with impossible dreams." Mr. Lee was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up a chair beside her. "Let me tell you a story," he said softly. "When I was young, in Hong Kong, my family had a small noodle shop. Every penny went to keeping it running. But I had this dream of playing violin. My parents thought it was nonsense. What good was a violin in a noodle shop?" He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "One day, a customer heard me practicing on a borrowed violin in the back alley. He turned out to be a music teacher, offered to teach me for free if I'd help clean his studio. My parents still thought it was foolish, but they saw how much it meant to me." "Did they ever change their minds?" Mai asked, wiping her eyes. Mr. Lee smiled. "The day I played my first concert, I looked out into the audience. There was my whole family, still in their work clothes, tired from a long day at the shop. My mother was crying. Not because of the music, she told me later, but because she'd never seen me so fully myself." He reached out and placed his weathered hands over Mai's on the piano keys. "We all have moments where our dreams feel impossible, where the weight of responsibility tries to crush our passion. But sometimes, the most responsible thing we can do is honor the fire inside us." "But Lynn's medical bills are not yours alone to carry," he interrupted gently. "You have people in your corner now. Let them help." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Rodriguez stood there with Mr. Kumar and several other diner regulars. "We heard about your sister," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "We've started a medical fund. The whole neighborhood's pitching in." "We take care of our own," Mr. Kumar added firmly. Mai looked at them all. These people who had become so much more than customers. Her hands were still shaking, but now for a different reason. The music inside her stirred again, no longer feeling like a selfish indulgence, but like a thread connecting all these hearts that had opened to her. She turned back to the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time, the Rachmaninoff flowed differently. Not perfect, but real. Raw. Every note carried the story of struggle and support, of dreams that refuse to die, of a community that holds each other up when things get hard. And somewhere in those notes, Mai found her strength again. Because sometimes breaking down isn't about falling apart. It's about letting others help put you back together, stronger than before. The morning of the competition dawned crisp and clear. Mai stood in front of her tiny bathroom mirror, barely recognizing herself in the elegant black dress Mrs. Chen had altered for her. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned back her hair, no longer in its usual waitress ponytail. Lynn sat on the closed toilet lid, looking much better after her treatment, clutching a thermos of Uncle Pete's special competition day tea. "You look like Mom," she said softly. "She would have loved seeing you like this." The competition hall was massive, all polished wood and high ceilings. Mi's footsteps echoed as she followed an usher to the warm-up room. Other competitors sat there, all looking perfectly composed in their performance attire, many from prestigious music schools. Their confidence made her feel small, like she was playing pretend in her borrowed dress. Mr. Lee found her sitting alone in a corner, her fingers silently practicing on her knees. "Nervous?" he asked, settling beside her. "Terrified," she admitted. "Everyone else seems so prepared. Maybe I don't belong here." "Look out there," he said, nodding toward the auditorium door. Mai peeked through and her heart nearly stopped. There, filling 3 entire rows, were her people from the diner. Uncle Pete in a suit that had to be decades old. The construction crew, work boots polished, hard hats replaced with dress shirts. Mrs. Rodriguez grading papers to stay calm. Mr. Wong from the music shop with his wife's favorite flowers. Even Joe had closed the diner early, a first in 20 years. They looked out of place among the usual competition crowd, but they sat there proud and straight, like they absolutely belonged. Because they did belong. They were part of her story, every single one of them. Number 23, Mai Chen, called the stage manager. "You're up in 5 minutes." The walk to the grand piano felt like floating in a dream. The spotlight was warm on her face as she bowed to the judges, their expressions neutral and waiting. She sat at the piano, its keys gleaming under the lights, and took a deep breath. Then she saw Lin in the front row, giving her their secret childhood thumbs up. Behind her, Mrs. Chen was dabbing her eyes already. Mr. Patel and his crew sat perfectly still, like they did during their lunch breaks outside the music shop. They weren't here for perfect technique or flawless execution. They were here for her story, told through Rachmaninoff's notes. So Mi closed her eyes and began to play. She played for the early morning diner rush, for spilled coffee and patient smiles. For Mr. Wong's empty music shop after hours, for every encouragement scribbled on napkins. She played for hospital waiting rooms and community fundraisers, for dreams that refuse to die even when reality gets hard. The music flowed from her fingers like a river finding its path home. When the challenging parts came, the ones that had made her doubt herself, she heard Mr. Lee's gentle corrections guiding her through. The quiet moments in the piece carried echoes of her mother's old songs, while the powerful crescendos held all the strength her community had given her. Time disappeared. The world shrank to just her, the piano, and the story they were telling together. Each note was a thank you, each phrase a celebration of every person who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. When the final notes faded into silence, Mai opened her eyes to find tears on her cheeks. For a moment, the hall was absolutely quiet. Then, from the back row, little Raj's voice piped up. That was better than pancakes. The spell broke. Laughter and applause rolled through the hall like thunder. As Mai stood to bow, she saw Mrs. Rodriguez hugging Mrs. Chen, both of them crying. Uncle Pete was pretending something was in his eye. The construction crew were on their feet, whooping like they were at a baseball game. Walking off stage, Mai realized it didn't matter what the judges thought. She'd already won something far more valuable than any competition prize. She'd found her voice, her community, her truth, all through 88 keys and a dream that refused to stay quiet. Mr. Lee met her backstage, his eyes shining. "Now that," he said, squeezing her hands, "was music from the heart." 3 months after the competition, Joe's diner had changed. A small upright piano now sat in the corner, its warm wood gleaming in the morning sunlight. The breakfast regulars had gotten used to their coffee coming with a side of classical music, as Mai would often play during the quiet moments between rushes. She hadn't won first place at the competition. That had gone to a prodigy from a famous conservatory. But her performance had earned her second place, which came with something even better. A flexible scholarship to the city's music school, allowing her to study while keeping her morning shifts at the diner. Best of both worlds. Uncle Pete said one morning, watching her balance plates while humming a new piece she was learning. Though I still say the judges were deaf. You should have won first. The scholarship money, combined with the community's medical fund, had covered Lynn's hospital bills. The tests had revealed nothing serious, just exhaustion and low iron levels, easily treated. Now, Lynn would sometimes study at the diner counter, looking up from her textbooks to smile whenever Mai played their mother's favorite songs. Mr. Lee still came in regularly, though now he brought his violin case. During slow afternoons, the diner would fill with impromptu duets, their music drawing people in from the street. Even the grumpy morning coffee crew had stopped complaining about all that fancy music. Mrs. Chen had caught Mr. Thompson, their crankiest member, tapping his foot to a Mozart piece. The construction crew had finished their project down the street, but they still came in for lunch. They developed surprisingly sophisticated musical tastes, often requesting specific classical pieces. Mr. Patel had even started taking piano lessons himself. Never too old to learn, he'd say with a grin, showing off the simple tunes he'd mastered. His calloused hands, used to handling heavy tools, now moved carefully over the keys during his practice sessions after closing time. One evening, as Mai wiped down tables after the dinner rush, she found a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a framed photo, her performance at the competition, captured just as she finished playing. She was smiling through tears, the spotlight making her borrowed dress shimmer, while in the background, her entire diner family was on their feet applauding. "Thought you might want to hang it up," Joe said gruffly, pretending to be very interested in the coffee maker. "Good for business, you know. People like seeing where their waitress came from." The photo found its home above the piano, next to the competition program and the first dollar the diner had ever earned. Sometimes, new customers would ask about it, and the regulars would proudly tell the story of their waitress who played Rachmaninoff between coffee refills. The city's music school turned out to be different from what Mai had imagined. Her classmates were curious about her unusual path to music, and some even started coming to the diner to practice. The quiet space after closing became an unofficial gathering spot for young musicians, their diverse styles blending with the smell of coffee and pie. Mr. Wong from the music shop had expanded his back room into a proper practice space, inspired by how his wife's old piano had helped start it all. Now other aspiring musicians from the neighborhood could find their own path, just as Mai had. On Sunday mornings, Mai still played the early shift, her uniform now accessorized with sheet music in the pocket. But now, when her fingers danced over plates and coffee cups, they moved with the same grace they showed on piano keys. She'd found her rhythm, a melody made of morning rushes and music scales, of classic concertos and classic breakfast specials. Life had become its own kind of symphony, sometimes challenging, sometimes sweet, but always carrying the warmth of community and the joy of dreams realized in unexpected ways. Because in the end, it wasn't just about playing music. It was about finding the courage to let your heart sing, even if the song wasn't quite what you'd imagined. And every morning, as she unlocked the diner's door and heard the familiar bell chime, Mai smiled. The sound blended perfectly with the morning's first notes, creating a harmony that felt exactly like home.